My husband cried when he checked me into a memory care facility. Actually cried. Held my hand in the parking lot, told me he loved me, told me this was the hardest decision he'd ever made. And I believed him. 3 weeks later, I discovered I owned the building. By then, he'd already put our house under contract. And that's when I realized something that still makes my stomach turn when I think about it. There was never anything wrong with my memory. The problem was that I'd trusted the wrong person with it. My name is Margaret Parker. I'm 61 years old. Or at least I was when all this happened. Before everything fell apart, I lived what most people would call a pretty normal life in Scottsdale, Arizona. I spent more than 3 decades working as a physical therapist. I helped stroke victims learn to walk again, helped accident survivors rebuild strength, helped people recover pieces of themselves they thought were gone forever. I loved it. Not because it paid well, because it mattered. There's something powerful about watching someone realize they're stronger than they thought they were. Funny enough, I ended up needing that lesson myself. I met David Collins at a charity fundraiser in 2009. The story you mentioned 6 months ago and forgot about yourself. Back then, it felt romantic. Now, I know better. People who pay that much attention aren't always learning how to love you. Sometimes, they're learning how to influence you. We got married 2 years later. For a long time, life was good. Not perfect, just comfortable. And when you're old enough to appreciate it, comfortable feels pretty close to perfect. Then, my mother died. That was the beginning. I just didn't know it yet. Losing my mother hit harder than I expected. She'd been 84, independent, sharp, the kind of woman who still balanced her own checkbook and corrected your grammar while doing it. After the funeral, I found myself handling paperwork I wasn't emotionally prepared for. There were investments, retirement accounts, property holdings, trust documents, the usual things people leave behind when they've spent a lifetime building something. David helped me sort through all of it. At the time, I was grateful. Looking back, I realize he was positioning himself. One document in particular barely registered in my mind. Something involving a healthcare property owned through a family trust. My mother had mentioned it over the years, never in much detail. I signed what needed signing and moved on. Big mistake. The truth is, grief makes you vulnerable. You stop paying attention to things you normally would have questioned. And somebody was paying attention. David. Around that same time, he started working with a marketing consultant named Rachel Bennett. 28 years old, smart, ambitious, always calling, always emailing, always needing something. At least that's what David said. I never questioned it. Why would I? I trusted my husband, and I wasn't looking for reasons not to. About a year after my mother's death, David started noticing things. At least that's how he presented it. Little things, tiny things, harmless things, the kind of mistakes everybody makes. Margaret, you left the stove on. Margaret, didn't we already talk about this? Margaret, are you feeling okay? At first, I laughed it off. Everybody forgets things. Everybody misplaces keys. Everybody walks into a room and forgets why they went there. But David didn't mention it once, or twice, or occasionally. He mentioned it constantly, quietly, patiently, like someone planting seeds, one at a time, every day. Until eventually, something starts growing, even if you never intended it to. One night we were having dinner with friends. Nothing special, just food and conversation. Then David smiled and said, "Margaret's been getting a little forgetful lately." Everyone laughed, including me. But on the drive home, I found myself staring out the passenger window, wondering why he'd felt the need to say it. A few weeks later, my daughter Nina called. Halfway through our conversation, she asked, "Mom, are you okay?" I laughed. Of course. There was a pause. Then she said something that made my stomach tighten. "David's just been worried about you." I didn't know what to say because I had never told Nina anything was wrong. Apparently, David had. And not just Nina. Friends, neighbors, family members, everybody. Always expressing concern, always worried, always trying to help. The scary part wasn't that he lied. The scary part was how reasonable the lies sounded. Nobody would have questioned them. I didn't. Eventually, I started keeping notes. Not because I thought I was losing my memory, because I wanted proof that I wasn't. Every appointment, every conversation, every errand, every phone call, everything went into a small notebook. Then one morning, 3 pages were gone. Just gone. Torn cleanly out. I searched the house twice. Never found them. When I asked David about it, he looked genuinely offended. "Why would I take your notes?" I actually apologized. Think about that. I apologized for asking. Looking back, that's probably the moment I stopped trusting myself. And once that happens, somebody else gets to decide what's true. The situation got worse over the next year. Not dramatically, gradually. That's what made it effective. David would point out mistakes before I noticed them. Correct details I was sure I remembered. Remind me of conversations I didn't recall having. Every single incident seemed too small to argue about. But together, they created a pattern, a story. One where I was slowly becoming unreliable, even to myself. Then came the doctor. David suggested a cognitive evaluation. Just to be safe. Just to rule things out. Just to make sure everything was okay. I agreed, because by then, I wasn't sure of anything anymore. The appointment should have been my warning. When I arrived, I saw David walking out of the doctor's private office. Not the waiting room, the office. The 2 men stopped talking the second they noticed me. It felt strange. I remember thinking it felt strange. Then immediately convincing myself I was overreacting. That's the thing about manipulation. After enough time, you start doing half the work for them. The doctor asked memory questions, simple tests, basic evaluations. Nothing alarming, nothing dramatic. And yet somehow, the recommendation was a short-term stay at a memory care facility. Just a few weeks. Observation only. David squeezed my hand. Told me it was the smart thing to do. Told me we'd get answers. Told me everything would be okay. And by then, I believed him. The facility was called Sunrise Ridge. David drove me there himself, held my hand the entire way, played the role of devoted husband perfectly. When we arrived, he carried my bag inside, completed paperwork, answered questions, spoke for me more often than he spoke to me. And somehow I didn't even notice. That's how gradual it had been. I'd gotten used to letting him define reality. David kissed my forehead before leaving, told me he'd visit every day. Then he walked out the front door. I watched his car disappear from the parking lot. I had no idea I was watching my old life disappear with it. The first few days at Sunrise Ridge were miserable. Not because the staff was bad. They weren't. Everyone was kind, patient, professional. The problem was that I didn't belong there. Most of the residents were in their late 70s, 80s, and 90s. People genuinely struggling with memory loss. People who forgot their children's names. People who got confused about where they were. People fighting battles I wasn't fighting. Every morning I'd look around and think the same thing. What am I doing here? The answer seemed obvious. I was there because David loved me. Because David was worried. Because David wanted to help. At least that's what I kept telling myself. Funny how many lies begin with the words, "He would never." Across the hall lived a woman named Gloria. Gloria was 82 years old and had exactly zero interest in pretending to be polite. The first thing she ever said to me was, "You don't belong here." I laughed. That's a little direct. She shrugged. "I'm old. I don't have time for subtle." That was Gloria. Brutally honest, sharp as a razor blade, and somehow one of the funniest people I'd ever met. Within 3 days, she knew everybody's business. Within a week, she knew mine. One afternoon while we sat outside in the courtyard, she looked at me and said, "Your husband gives me the creeps." I nearly choked on my coffee. "What?" She shrugged. "Too nice." I laughed. "That's not a crime." "No," Gloria said, "but it's usually a warning." At the time, I dismissed it. Today, I wish I'd listened. David visited exactly twice. Twice! That's it! The man who insisted I needed constant supervision suddenly seemed too busy to stop by. The excuses were always reasonable. Meetings, travel, deadlines, emergencies. And somehow every excuse involved Rachel. Rachel needed something. Rachel had a project. Rachel had a client meeting. Rachel was helping with a presentation. Rachel. 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 The name kept appearing. At the time, it barely registered. Later, it became impossible to ignore. 3 weeks into my stay, a nurse named Carmen stopped by my room. Carmen was one of those people who naturally made everyone feel comfortable. She remembered birthdays, favorite snacks, grandchildren's names. The kind of person who belonged in healthcare. She was updating my chart when she casually said, "It's nice that the owner's family still takes such an interest in the place." I looked up. The owner's family? Yeah. She smiled. The Parkers. My heart skipped. Parker. My maiden name. I stared at her. "Carmen." She looked up from her tablet. "Who owns Sunrise Ridge?" She frowned. "The Parker Family Trust." The room suddenly felt very quiet. The Parker Family Trust. My mother's trust. The trust David had handled after she died. trust I'd barely thought about in years. Carmen continued talking. I didn't hear another word. Because suddenly, I remembered something. My mother standing in her kitchen years earlier, holding paperwork, looking directly at me, saying, "Margaret, if anything ever happens to me, Sunrise Ridge stays in the family." At the time, I hadn't thought much about it. Now it felt like a message from beyond the grave. The second Carmen left, I grabbed my phone and called Nina. She answered immediately. "Mom, I need trust documents." Silence. Then, "What happened?" "Just pull them." Another pause. "Tonight." The lawyer voice arrived instantly. The one that meant she already knew something was wrong. "I'll call you back." 45 minutes later, my phone rang. I answered before the first ring finished. Nina sounded different. Controlled. Focused. Dangerous. "Mom?" "What?" "Are you sitting down?" I almost laughed. "I've been sitting down for 3 weeks." She didn't laugh. Not even a little. That's when I knew. Something was wrong. Really wrong. "Mom," she said carefully, "you're the managing trustee." I frowned. "Of what?" "Everything." I sat up straighter. "The facility?" "Yes." "The trust?" "Yes." "The investments?" "Yes." My pulse started climbing. I felt sick and strangely relieved at the same time, because for the first time in months, reality actually made sense. Then Nina said, "There's something else." Of course there was. There always is. She took a deep breath. "The Scottsdale house is under contract." I froze. "What?" "There's already a buyer." The room tilted. "What do you mean there's a buyer?" "Closing is scheduled in 48 hours. 48 hours! While I sat inside a memory care facility questioning my own sanity, my husband was trying to sell our home? The home we'd shared for 13 years. The home filled with photographs, Christmas decorations, birthday dinners, family memories. Everything. I couldn't breathe. Then Nina spoke again, and somehow things got worse. "Mom, what now?" I found large transfers. My stomach tightened. How large? Just over $200,000. The number hit me like a punch. What? They've been moving through accounts over the last 18 months. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. David had never mentioned any of it. Not once. Then Nina went quiet. The silence lasted long enough to scare me. "What?" "I found an apartment lease." I closed my eyes. Suddenly afraid I already knew where this was going. "Whose apartment?" Another pause. Then, David's. I felt something inside me crack. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Enough to know nothing would ever be the same again. And there's another name listed. I already knew. I didn't want to know, but I knew. Who? Nina's answer came softly. "Rachel Bennett." The room went completely silent. Rachel. The consultant, the late-night calls, the weekend conferences, the emergency meetings, constant interruptions. Suddenly, every excuse David had ever given me clicked into place, one after another, like dominoes falling. For months, I had questioned my memory. For months, I had questioned my judgment. For months, I had questioned myself. Turns out, I wasn't the problem. I never was. I looked out the window. Residents walked through the courtyard. The Arizona sun lit up the garden. Across the lawn, Gloria was arguing with another resident about card game rules. Life continued moving forward, like it always does. And for the first time in years, I felt completely clear. Not confused, not uncertain, not afraid. Angry. Very angry. The kind of anger that burns away doubt. I picked up the phone. Nina? Yeah? Get every document. Already doing it. Call the trust attorney. I will. And don't tell David a damn thing. There was a brief silence. Then Nina laughed. A real laugh. The first one all day. Now you sound like my mother. For the first time in weeks, I smiled. And somewhere deep inside me, Margaret Parker started coming back. The next morning, Nina arrived carrying a banker's box full of documents. Trust records, property filings, bank statements, transfer histories, the apartment lease, everything. She set the box on the small table in my room and looked at me carefully. You okay? It was a simple question, but it took me a second to answer. Because the truth was, I wasn't. Not really. I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't scared anymore. But I was grieving. And that's the strange thing about betrayal. You don't just lose the person, you lose the future you thought you were going to have with them. I spent nearly 13 years building a life with David. Now I was learning that while I was building it, he'd been planning his exit. For the next 2 hours, I read every document, every page, every signature, every transfer, every lie. The trust attorney, Robert Ellis, joined us by video call first, then in person. By noon, he'd reviewed everything. By 1 o'clock, his expression had gone from concern to disbelief. By 2 o'clock, he'd contacted the facility director. And by 3, we had a plan. A very simple plan. Let David walk into the truth, the same way he'd walked me into a lie. The facility director's name was Pauline. Professional, calm, efficient, and completely stunned by the situation. Apparently, it isn't every day you discover one of your residents owns the building. She gave us access to her office, closed the door, and let us prepare. By 4 p.m., the conference table was covered in documents. Trust paperwork, house sale records, bank statements, the apartment lease. Everything neatly organized. Waiting. The way evidence waits before a trial. At 4:12 p.m., Carmen texted me. He's here. My stomach tightened. Not from fear, from anticipation. I stood and walked to the office window. Outside, David stepped out of his car, holding flowers. Flowers! Even now that detail feels ridiculous. The man was trying to steal my home, my assets, and my future. But apparently, he still thought flowers would complete the performance. He smiled at the receptionist, made small talk, thanked her, then headed toward the office, relaxed, confident, completely unaware that his entire plan had already collapsed. The door opened. David stepped inside and froze. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. I sat behind Pauline's desk. Nina stood beside me. Robert sat across from us. The conference table was covered in documents. David's eyes moved from face to face, trying to understand what he was seeing, trying to regain control. For the first time in years, he couldn't. Margaret. His voice sounded different, smaller. Sit down, David. He remained standing. Margaret, what's going on? Sit down. The second time, he listened. Robert began speaking first. Not emotionally, not dramatically, just facts. The Parker Family Trust, the ownership structure, my authority as managing trustee, the attempted house sale, the financial transfers, potential civil liability, potential fraud exposure. Each sentence chipped away another piece of David's confidence. I watched it happen in real time. The smile disappeared, then the certainty, then the excuses. All that remained was panic. Finally, he interrupted. I was trying to help her. The room fell silent. Robert stopped speaking. David turned toward me. Margaret, I was worried about you. I stared at him, really stared at him. And suddenly I saw something I'd never noticed before. The concern wasn't real. The kindness wasn't real. The patience wasn't real. Those things had been tools, nothing more. I opened a folder and slid it across the table. The house contract. David didn't touch it. You already know what's inside. His jaw tightened. Margaret. No. I raised a hand. For years, I'd let him interrupt me, correct me, redirect me. Not anymore. You don't get to do that anymore. The room went silent again. I opened another folder. Bank transfers, wire confirmations, account histories. $200,000. Gone. His face paled. Then I opened the final folder. The apartment lease. For the first time all afternoon, David looked away. I leaned forward and asked one question. Just one. When exactly were you planning to tell me you were moving in with her? Nothing. Not a word. His silence answered everything. Nina folded her arms. Robert adjusted his glasses. The room felt impossibly still. Finally, David spoke. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. I almost laughed. Instead, I asked, which part? He looked confused. The affair? Silence. The house sale? Nothing. The memory care facility? Still nothing. Every answer was written on his face. Then he tried something unexpected. He cried. Not like the tears in the parking lot. Those had been calculated. These were different. Messy. Desperate. The tears of a man watching his plan collapse. I never wanted to hurt you. That sentence made me angrier than everything else. Because it wasn't true. Maybe he hadn't wanted consequences, but he'd absolutely been willing to hurt me. People don't accidentally convince their spouse they're losing their mind. People don't accidentally put their home under contract. People don't accidentally sign an apartment lease with another woman. Those aren't mistakes. Those are decisions. I stood. The room stood with me. And for the first time since all this started, I felt completely steady. My mother built Sunrise Ridge to protect people who were losing their memories. David looked up. I continued. You tried to use it to steal mine. His face crumpled. But I wasn't finished. For 3 years, you made me question myself. I took a breath. You made my daughter question me. Another breath. You made my friends question me. Then I looked directly into his eyes. And the worst part? His shoulders slumped. I believed you. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Because there was nothing left to say.
David whispered my name one last time. Margaret. I shook my head. No. Then I picked up my purse, turned toward the door, and stopped. Not for him. For me. I looked back over my shoulder. The irony is that you spent years convincing people I couldn't be trusted with my own life. His eyes filled with tears. I smiled sadly. In the end, you're the one nobody believes. Then, I walked out, leaving him exactly where he'd planned to leave me. Powerless.
The house sale was stopped within 24 hours. Every transfer was investigated. Every account was reviewed. Every document was examined. The divorce took 8 months, mostly because David refused to accept reality. Apparently, denial wasn't just something he'd prescribed for me. He'd been taking it himself. Rachel moved into the apartment. David moved in shortly after. From what I heard, neither of them were nearly as happy together as they'd imagined. I never asked for details. Some endings don't need witnesses. As for me, I became involved in Sunrise Ridge. Not because I had to, because I wanted to. I met every employee, learned every resident's story, attended meetings, fundraisers, events. The place that had been used to isolate me became one of the places that healed me. And every Tuesday afternoon, I played cards with Gloria. Or more accurately, I lost cards to Gloria repeatedly. The woman swore she never cheated. I remain unconvinced. A few months after the divorce was finalized, I found an old photograph of my mother. She was standing outside Sunrise Ridge, smiling, holding a set of keys. I stared at that picture for a long time. Then I placed it on my office shelf, right where I could see it every day. For 3 weeks, I thought I was losing my memory. Turns out, I was losing trust. And unlike memory, trust doesn't come back just because somebody asks for it. David lost a marriage. Rachel lost the future she thought she was building. And I gained something I didn't realize I'd been missing. Myself. Turns out, there was never anything wrong with my mind. I had simply trusted the wrong person with it. And that made all the difference.